Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights a little. Tonight, we're going to float back in time, back to the biting winds and damp fjords of 11th century Norway. We're going to talk about a man who was, for all intents and purposes, the last echo of the Viking Age. A man whose life was so ridiculously full of violence, ambition, and questionable choices that it feels less like history and more like a grim Nordic soap opera. We're talking about a man born Harald Sigurdsson, but known to history by a name that tells you everything you need to know about him: Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. So, get cozy, and let's gently drift into the very loud, very unfortunate life of Harald Hardrada, the man who wanted to be king of everything and, in the process, became a perfect historical bedtime story. A long, meandering, and ultimately very sleepy story about how ambition is a heck of a thing. Our story begins around the year 1015 in a part of Norway called Ringerike. Here, a woman named Jada Gudbrandstader was married to a local chieftain, a petty king, really, named Sigurd Seer. Sigurd was one of those respectable, down-to-earth types, mostly concerned with running his farm and keeping his affairs in order. And to this couple, a son was born, their youngest. They named him Harald. Through his mother, young Harald was the half-brother of the sitting king of Norway, a man named Olaf Haraldsson. His connection to royalty is, of course, where all the trouble starts. It always is. From a young age, it was apparently quite clear that Harald was not like his father or his older brothers. While they were content with the quiet dignity of managing land, Harald was different. The sagas, which are our main, slightly mythical source for all this, describe him as having big ambitions, which is a polite way of saying he was probably an absolute menace as a teenager. He looked up to his half-brother Olaf, the king, as his role model, not his sensible, farm-managing father, but the brother who was currently trying to wrestle all of Norway into a unified Christian kingdom, mostly by hitting people who disagreed with him. A classic case of hero worship and a terrible omen. For the future now, Norway in the early 11th century was a messy place. The idea of it being one unified country was still a fairly new and wobbly concept. For decades it had been a patchwork of petty kingdoms and warring chieftains, all before being unceremoniously scooped up into the massive North Sea empire of Canute the Great, the King of Denmark and England. Canute was the undisputed heavyweight, champion of Northern Europe, and Norwegian independence wasn't high on his list of priorities. King Olaf II, Harald's half-brother, had managed to carve out a space for himself as King of Norway, but his grip was tenuous. He was a zealous Christian in a land that was still very much attached to its old gods, and his methods of conversion were, let's just call them forceful. This didn't win him many friends among the powerful local nobles, who rather liked their traditions and, more importantly, their autonomy. Eventually, their discontent boiled over. In 1028, with the backing of the absurdly powerful King Canute, they revolted and kicked Olaf out of the country. Olaf was forced into exile, fleeing east to the Kievan Rus. 2 years later, in 1030, Olaf decided it was time for a comeback. He'd had a dream, you see, which he interpreted as a sign from God to return and reclaim his kingdom. So he gathered his men, left his young son Magnus in the care of the Kievan court, and headed back to Norway to fight for his throne. And this is where our boy Harald properly enters the historical stage. When news of Olaf's planned return reached Norway, 15-year-old Harald, brimming with all the misplaced confidence of a teenager, decided this was his moment. He gathered about 600 men from his homeland in the uplands and marched to meet his half-brother. You have to picture it. A boy, barely old enough to grow a decent beard, leading a small army to join a deposed king in a desperate bid to win back a kingdom from the most powerful ruler in the North Sea. The odds were, to put it mildly, not great. Olaf's returning army, now bolstered by Harald and his men, marched into a valley about 80 kilometers north of Trondheim. They came to a farm called Stakelstad, and waiting for them was a much, much larger army. It was a coalition of Norwegian chieftains and landowners, men who were loyal to Canute the Great or simply fed up with Olaf's heavy-handed rule and his new religion. It was, in essence, a rebellion of his own people. The battle that followed, on July 29, 1030, is one of the most famous in Norwegian history, the Battle of Stiklestad. It was, by all accounts, a complete disaster for Olaf's side. They were horribly outnumbered. According to the sagas, Olaf fought bravely, but it was a lost cause. He was struck in the knee, then the neck, and finally, a spear was thrust up under his mail shirt, delivering a mortal wound. The king was dead, and in the middle of this chaos was 15-year-old Harald. He fought alongside his brother, and he was wounded in the fray. But when the king fell and the battle was lost, Harald managed to escape. With the help of another noble, he was spirited away to a remote farm in eastern Norway to recover from his injuries. So let's just pause and take stock of Harald's situation. He's 15. His king and half-brother has just been killed in battle by his own people. His side lost catastrophically. He himself is wounded and now a fugitive in his own country, which is firmly under the control of his enemies. For most people, this would be the end of the story. A sad little footnote about a teenager who picked the wrong side in a civil war. But Harald, it seems, was not most people. This wasn't an end for him. It was a beginning. It was the brutal, bloody education that would shape the rest of his very long, very complicated life. The quiet life of a farmer was now permanently off the table. Instead, a 15-year-old boy, nursing his wounds and a healthy dose of ambition, had to figure out what to do next. And with Norway no longer an option, the only way to go is out. For a wounded teenage prince on the run, there weren't many options. Going back home wasn't one of them. The men who had just killed his brother were now in charge, and they wouldn't be thrilled to find a surviving member of the old royal line hanging around. So after healing up for a month or so at that secluded farm, Harald did what many a disgraced Norseman did in the 11th century. He headed east. He slipped across the border into Sweden, and from there began the long journey to the land the sagas called Gar or Riki, the kingdom of the Rus. A year after the chaos of Stiklestad, sometime in 1031, Harald and the handful of men who had escaped with him arrived at the court of the Grand Prince of Kiev, Yaroslav the Wise. This wasn't a random choice. Yaroslav's wife, a Swedish princess named Ingard, was a distant relative of Harald's. More importantly, this was the same court that had sheltered his half-brother Olaf during his earlier exile. Yaroslav had a history of welcoming politically inconvenient Norwegian royals. You can imagine the scene. A 16-year-old Harald, probably still all gangly limbs and teenage awkwardness, but now with battle scars and the haunted look of a fugitive, presenting himself to the Grand Prince. He had no army to speak of, no money, and no prospects. All he had was his name and the story of his brother's failed attempt to reclaim his throne. Fortunately for Harald, that was enough. Yaroslav, being a wise and pragmatic ruler, saw potential in the intense young Norwegian. He was badly in need of capable military leaders. And this kid, despite his recent loss, clearly had some experience and a certain drive. The sagas say Yaroslav welcomed him first and foremost because he was Olaf's brother, but it's more likely he saw a useful tool. So, he made Harald a captain in his forces. And just like that, Harald Sigurdsson, the failed revolutionary, began his second career, mercenary. Spent the next few years fighting for Yaroslav, leading men in campaigns against the Poles and other enemies of the Kievan Rus. It was here that he began to learn the trade of war not as a matter of dynastic right, but as a profession. He learned about command, about logistics, about the brutal calculus of being a soldier for hire. This wasn't a noble quest to restore a kingdom anymore. This was work. And by all accounts, he was very, very good at it. It was also in Kiev that he first laid eyes on Yaroslav's daughter, Elizabeth, or as the Norse sources call her, Elisif. She was a princess of one of the most powerful courts in Eastern Europe, and Harald, the landless exile, was immediately captivated. The sagas hint at a romance, but it's hard to imagine Yaroslav being keen on marrying his daughter to a teenage Norwegian mercenary with no kingdom and no fortune. Harald might have had ambitions, but he had nothing to offer. Not yet, anyway. The message was probably clear. Come back when you've made something of yourself, so After a few years in Yaroslav's service, having honed his skills and built a small following of loyal Norsemen, Harald decided it was time to move on. He was probably around 19 or 20 by now. The life of a captain in the Rus was fine, but it wasn't going to make him rich, and it wasn't going to win him a princess. He needed to go where the real money and the real glory were. And in the 11th century, for an ambitious warrior, that meant only one place: Constantinople, the great city, or as the Norsemen called it, Miklagard. Around 1034, Harald and his force of about 500 loyal veterans packed up and headed south. Down the great river routes that linked the land of the Rus to the Black Sea, their destination was the glittering, impossibly wealthy capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or as we call it today, the Byzantine Empire. They were going to the heart of the civilized world to offer their swords to the highest bidder. Specifically, they were going to join the most elite, most feared mercenary unit in the world, the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, composed almost exclusively of Norsemen, Rus, and later Anglo-Saxons. They were legendary for their ferocity, their loyalty bought with vast amounts of gold and their terrifyingly large axes. To serve in the Guard was to have a front row, seat to the power, paranoia, and endless backstabbing of the Byzantine court. It was dangerous, but it was also incredibly lucrative. For a young man like Harald, looking to make his fortune and his name, it was the perfect opportunity. He had left Norway as a wounded boy. He arrived in Constantinople as a seasoned commander, ready to sell his services to an emperor, and, in the process, build the foundation for his own future kingdom. The quiet part of his life was over. The loud part was just getting started. So Harald and his 500 Norsemen arrive in Constantinople. You have to try and imagine the sheer sensory overload. For men raised in the cold, damp, and relatively straightforward world of Scandinavia and the Rus, Miklagard must have seemed like another planet. A city of 1 million people, with towering walls, golden domed churches, marble palaces, and streets, teeming with people from every corner of the known world. It was a city of silks and spices, of complex bureaucracy, and even more complex theology. And for a Viking, it was a city practically dripping with gold. It was the ultimate jackpot. Upon his arrival, Harald, with his royal lineage and his ready-made company of hardened warriors, had no trouble getting an audience. He presented himself to the reigning emperor, Michael IV. Michael was an interesting character. He was a former moneylender of low birth who had become the lover of the Empress Zoe, one of the most powerful and formidable women in Byzantine history. When Zoe's husband, the old emperor Romanos III, died under suspicious circumstances, he was allegedly drowned in his bath. Michael was promptly married to the empress and placed on the throne, because of course, that's how things worked in Constantinople. It was a city where the line between the bedroom and the throne room was, shall we say, blurry. Harald, with his imposing height and the quiet confidence of a man who'd already survived one civil war, clearly made an impression. He and his men were immediately enrolled in the Varangian Guard. Now, while the Guard was the emperor's personal security detail, that wasn't their only job. They were also the empire's elite. Shock troops, the troubleshooters sent to the most dangerous and politically sensitive frontiers of the empire. And the empire, as always, had plenty of frontiers that needed troubleshooting. Harald didn't spend much time lounging around the palace. Almost immediately, he was put to work. His first assignments were against Arab pirates who were plaguing the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. This was classic Viking work, just with a different employer and better pay. He learned to command fleets, to fight on the water, not for chaotic raids, but as part of a coordinated naval strategy. The sagas, in their typical, understated way, simply say, he cleared the sea of robbers, which likely involved a great deal of what we would politely call state-sanctioned piracy. After his success at sea, he was sent east to the dusty frontiers of Anatolia to fight against the Saracens. Here, in the borderlands between the Christian Empire and the Muslim caliphates, he led campaigns deep into enemy territory. It was a landscape utterly alien to a Norwegian hot, dry, and unforgiving. But war was war, and Harald was proving to be exceptionally good at it. He was methodical, he was ruthless, and most importantly, he was successful. His greatest test, however, came in Sicily. The island had been under Arab rule for centuries, and the Byzantines had decided it was time to take it back. In 1038, a massive expedition was launched, led by one of the empire's most brilliant generals, George Maniacs, and serving under Maniacs as a prominent commander of the Varangian contingent was Harald. The Sicilian campaign was a brutal island-hopping slugfest. The Varangians were at the forefront of every major assault, storming fortified towns and breaking enemy lines with their terrifying axe charges. The sagas are full of semi-legendary tales from this time, portraying Harald as an almost superhuman figure. One story tells of how, when his army was unable to take a particular fortress by force, Harald had his men capture birds that nested in the town. They then tied flammable materials to the birds' backs, lit them, and released them. The birds flew back to their nests under the eaves of the houses, setting the whole town on fire and forcing its surrender. It's a story that also gets told about other figures in Norse sagas, so it might be a bit of a stock tale. But it tells you the kind of reputation he was building. A commander who was not just brave, but clever, devious even. Throughout all these campaigns, Harald was doing something else besides just fighting. He was getting rich, incredibly rich. The Byzantine system allowed for, and even encouraged, commanders to take a significant share of the plunder. And Harald plundered with a professional's eye for value. Gold, jewels, precious silks, he took it all. But unlike many of his comrades, who probably spent their earnings on the plentiful distractions Constantinople had to offer, Harald was disciplined. He systematically sent his vast and growing fortune north, back to Kiev, entrusting it to his old patron, Yaroslav, the Wise. He was building a war chest. He might have been a mercenary in the emperor's service, but he hadn't forgotten his own long-term goals. Every city he sacked, every pirate ship he captured, was another step towards a throne. His service in the Varangian Guard elevated him through the ranks. He earned prestigious, if slightly ridiculous-sounding, Byzantine titles like Manglabites and Spatharocondidos. It's hard to imagine the towering, axe-wielding Viking caring much for the titles. But he certainly cared for the status and the pay that came with them. He became a man of immense importance and, as a result, a man who attracted notice. And in the Byzantine court, attracting notice was not always a good thing. The political situation back in Constantinople was, as usual, a mess. The Emperor Michael IV was chronically ill with epilepsy, and his health was failing. Real power was held by his brother, a powerful court official and eunuch named John the Orphanatrophos. John was the one pulling the strings, and he was deeply suspicious of anyone with power and a following of their own. A tall, successful, and increasingly wealthy barbarian commander with a private army of loyal Northmen. That was exactly the kind of person who made a man like John, the Orphanatrophos, very nervous. Then, in 1041, while Harald was off fighting in the Bulgarian campaign, another brutal frontier war, where he distinguished himself, Emperor Michael IV finally died. This set off a cascade of political instability. Michael's nephew was briefly crowned as Michael V, but he made the fatal mistake of trying to sideline the powerful Empress Zoe, the people of Constantinople, who had a strange and enduring affection for their long-reigning Macedonian dynasty, rioted in her favor. Michael V was overthrown, blinded, and exiled to a monastery because, again, Constantinople. In the ensuing chaos, the aged Empress Zoe and her equally aged sister Theodora were brought out of retirement and made co-rulers. It was at this point that Harald's fortunes took a dramatic turn for the worse. The sagas claim that Harald had fallen out of favor because he had been accused of keeping more than his fair share of the plunder, a charge that, given his systematic wealth hoarding, was probably true. Another more romanticized version claims that Empress Zoe herself had taken a fancy to the tall Norwegian and wanted to marry him, but he refused her. Given that Zoe was in her 60s at this point, this seems a little unlikely. But it makes for a good story. Whatever the specific reason, The new regime had no love for the men who had been favored by the old one. Harald was arrested and thrown into a palace dungeon. His glittering career as the empire's most successful mercenary had come to a screeching halt. He was imprisoned, his wealth was in jeopardy, and his life was in the hands of a notoriously fickle and paranoid court. For the second time in his life, Harald found himself on the losing side of a political upheaval, a prisoner with no obvious way out. The boy who had fled Norway was now a man trapped in the gilded cage of Miklagard, and once again he would have to find a way to escape. So there he was, Harald Sigurdsson, a man who had commanded armies and sacked cities, now sitting in a dark, presumably very uncomfortable Byzantine dungeon. His career, which had been a straight upward trajectory of violence and profit, had suddenly hit a very solid, very imperial wall. For many, this would have been the end. A quiet shanking, a slow poisoning, or a lifetime of staring at stone walls would be the typical retirement plan for a mercenary, who had fallen out of favor. But Harald, as we've established, had a habit of surviving things. The saga's never ones to let a good story be bogged down by verifiable facts, give us a rather colorful account of his imprisonment. According to one tale, his escape was aided by a noble lady who had a soft spot for the giant Norwegian. This, a mysterious woman, whose identity is conveniently lost to history, supposedly helped him. Another, more dramatic version of the story claims that, while in the dungeon, Harald was visited by the ghost of his saintly half-brother, Olaf, the sainted king, it seems, a break from his heavenly duties to provide some timely escape. Advice? The story even throws in a giant serpent living in the sewers of the dungeons, which Harald naturally strangled. Because, when you're building a legend, you might as well go all in. A saintly vision, a secret admirer, and a monster slaying. It covers all the bases, regardless of whether his escape was due to a friendly guard, a lovelorn noblewoman, or a divine/monstrous intervention. The outcome was the same. Harald got out. He didn't just slip away quietly, though. His style, he gathered other Varangians who were still loyal to him, and together, they made their way through the palace. In the chaos that still gripped the city following the recent coup, they managed to find the man who had overthrown and blinded the previous emperor, Michael V, and in a moment of what you might call poetic justice, or perhaps just straightforward revenge, they seized the unfortunate ex-emperor and blinded him. It was a very Byzantine goodbye present, now free, but very much a fugitive. Harald and his men needed to get out of the city and fast. They rushed down to the Golden Horn, the great natural harbor of Constantinople, and commandeered a couple of galleys. But there was a problem, a very big, very heavy iron problem. Stretching across the mouth of the harbor was the Great Chain, a massive barrier that could be raised to prevent enemy ships from entering, or in this case, anyone undesirable from leaving. It was the city's main line of naval defense, and it was very much in their way, trapped between the chain and the surely soon-to-be enraged city guard. Harald once again demonstrated the kind of devious thinking he'd honed in Sicily. He ordered his men in both ships to row as hard as they could, straight towards the chain. But just before they reached it, he had everyone run to the stern, the very back of the ships. This shifted the vessel's balance, causing the bow to lift high out of the water. One of the ships slid up and over the chain, its momentum carrying it clear. But Harald's own ship got stuck, balanced precariously on top of the massive iron links. For a moment, they were trapped. But Harald had another command. He ordered everyone to run to the front of the ship. The sudden shift in weight sent the bow crashing back down into the water on the other side of the chain, while the stern tipped up, sliding free. It was a brilliant, if slightly insane, piece of improvised physics. With the chain behind them, they rowed out into the Sea of Marmara, and didn't look back. The great city of Miklagard, the place that had made him rich and famous, and then tried to swallow him whole, was finally behind him. They sailed across the Black Sea, a journey that was likely far less dramatic than their exit from the harbor, and made their way back up the familiar river systems of the Rus. Sometime in late 1042, after nearly a decade away, Harald arrived back where his mercenary career had begun. The court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. He must have been a sight to behold. He was no longer the 16-year-old fugitive who had shown up with nothing but a name. He was now a man in his late 20s, scarred and hardened by a decade of constant warfare. He was a famous commander, a fugitive from the most powerful empire in the world, and most importantly, the owner of an immense fortune that had been sitting in Yaroslav's treasury, collecting dust and, presumably, interest. The sagas say that the amount of gold, jewels, and other treasures Harald had sent back was so vast that it was a treasure which no man in the northern lands had ever seen the like of in one man's possession. Yaroslav, who had faithfully kept it all for him, was undoubtedly impressed.
Harald
Had left as a boy with potential, he had returned as a man of immense substance, and with that substance he could finally make good on his old ambition. He went to Yaroslav and formally asked once again for the hand of his daughter, the princess, Elizabeth or Elisif. This time there was no hesitation. The landless mercenary was now one of the wealthiest free agents in Europe. Yaroslav readily agreed. The wedding took place in the winter of 1043 or 1044. It was the culmination of everything Harald had worked. For over the last 10 years, he had his princess, he had his fortune, he had a loyal following of battle-hardened Varangians who had escaped with him. He had everything he needed. Everything, that is, except a kingdom to call his own, his gaze. Now, turned back to the west. Back to the cold, rocky land he had fled as a wounded teenager. It was time to go home. But the home he was planning to return to was not the same one he had left. While Harald was off fighting in Sicily and charming empresses in Constantinople, things in Norway had changed. King Canute the Great, the Danish master of the North Sea Empire, had died. His vast kingdom had fragmented, and in the power vacuum, the Norwegian nobles had a change of heart about their old, martyred king, Olaf. It turns out, Danish rule wasn't much better, and a dead saintly king of their own looked a lot more appealing in hindsight. So, they had sent for Olaf's young son Magnus, who had been left behind in Kiev all those years ago. They had brought him back to Norway and made him king. Magnus, now known as Magnus the Good, was Harald's own nephew, and he was sitting on the throne that Harald had decided was rightfully his. The stage was set for a very, very awkward family reunion.